The summit's shadow. I always found peace in the mountains. While my classmates spent weekends in dorms or crowded coffee shops, I laced up my boots, grabbed my pack, and ventured into the wilderness. Hiking alone wasn't a preference, it was a necessity. Out there, with only the crunch of my boots on dirt and the whisper of the wind, I could think clearly. That Saturday morning started like any other. I had found an unmarked trail the weekend before, tucked behind a cluster of evergreens on the northwest ridge. It wasn't on any map I'd seen, which only made it more tempting. I packed light, just water, snacks, and my GPS. The sky was a dull gray as I set out, the kind of overcast that keeps the day locked in twilight. The trail was steeper than I expected. My legs burned as I climbed, and the higher I got, the colder the air grew. About an hour in, I stopped to catch my breath by a gnarled tree. That's when I saw the first cairn. A neat stack of stones, balanced with precision in the middle of the trail. "Ha," I muttered. Probably a marker from another hiker. But as I climbed, I saw more. They grew larger and more elaborate, almost like they were leading me somewhere. It felt intentional. The higher I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. My gut told me something was off, but I pushed the thought away. Superstition had no place out here. Then the trail opened into a clearing. In the center stood a shack, if you could even call it that. The wood was rotting, moss crept up the walls, and the roof sagged like it might collapse any second. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, staring at the shack. My first instinct was to turn back, but I'd come too far to let curiosity go unanswered. Carefully, I approached. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, creaking when I nudged it open. The smell hit me first, a mix of damp wood and something worse, like decay. The air was colder inside, heavy and stale. A table stood in the center of the single room. On it lay a journal, its leather cover warped and cracked with age. A lantern, its glass cloudy and broken, sat beside it. Dust covered everything. I picked up the journal, brushing off the dirt, and flipped it open. The pages were filled with cramped writing. June 12, 1973. I saw it again last night. The shadow that doesn't belong. It moves like smoke, silent and patient. It watches from the trees, just beyond the firelight. My breath caught. My hands trembled as I turned to the next entry. June 13, 1973. I thought I was imagining things, but I found its tracks in the clearing this morning. Not quite animal, not quite human. Something in between. It's getting closer. The writing became more frantic with each page, the ink jagged and smeared. June 15, 1973. I tried to leave, but the trail, it changed. The path led me back here. I don't know how, but I think it wants me to stay. A loud snap outside made me freeze. My stomach twisted as I stared at the door. My ears strained to hear past the pounding of my heart, but the forest was silent. Too silent. I stepped outside, gripping the journal like it was a lifeline. The clearing looked the same, except now the shadows between the trees seemed alive. My skin prickled, the air charged with something I couldn't explain. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the undergrowth, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs too long and thin. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin pinpricks of light that pierced through the gloom. I couldn't move. My body locked in place as it tilted its head, watching me like I was the intruder. Slowly, it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. I stumbled back toward the shack, my thoughts racing. The cairns. The journal. The shifting trail. It all made sense now. I wasn't alone. And whatever else was out here, it didn't want me to leave. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the spot where the figure had vanished. My legs felt like lead, my chest tight, every instinct in me screaming to leave. But where could I go? The journal's final entry burned in my mind, the path led me back here. It wants me to stay. I forced my feet to move, backtracking toward the trail I'd come from. The clearing seemed darker now, the trees towering higher, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The trail should have been easy to follow, an obvious dirt path cutting through the undergrowth. But the further I walked, the more unfamiliar it became. The terrain shifted subtly, the landmarks I remembered, a moss-covered boulder, a fallen log, were gone, replaced by nothing but an endless stretch of trees. Panic set in. I pulled out my GPS, but the screen flickered erratically, the compass spinning in dizzying circles. I tapped it, shook it, but the signal was gone. No bars. No coordinates. Just static. Stay calm, I muttered to myself, though my voice wavered. You've been lost before. Just backtrack. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps to the clearing. But after 10 minutes of walking, I found nothing, no clearing, no shack, not even the cairns. It was as though the forest itself was shifting, rearranging its paths to keep me in. The silence was oppressive now, a suffocating void that pressed down on me. I could hear every breath, every crunch of leaves underfoot. And yet, I felt watched. Hello. I called out, though the sound of my voice felt wrong here, swallowed up by the trees. Is someone there? No response. Just the faint rustle of leaves above. But then I saw it, movement in the corner of my eye. I turned sharply, but whatever it was had already slipped behind a tree. My pulse raced as I scanned the forest, but the figure didn't reappear. I kept moving, faster now, my boots pounding against the uneven ground. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their gnarled branches almost touching above me. Every step felt heavier, the air colder, denser. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with the rasp of dry leaves. It wasn't far, and it wasn't human. My grip tightened on the journal, the only thing I had that even felt real anymore. The growl came again, closer this time. I spun around, searching for the source. My eyes darted between the trees, but all I could see were shadows shifting in the dim light. And then the forest erupted with noise. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, the sound of something big moving fast. I bolted, adrenaline surging through me as I tore through the undergrowth. My heart hammered in my chest, my breaths ragged and sharp. I didn't know where I was running, only that I had to get away from whatever was chasing me. The forest was a blur, the trees blending together in a dizzying haze. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling forward, landing hard on my hands and knees. The journal skidded out of my grasp, landing a few feet away. Behind me, the growling stopped. I froze, my hands trembling as I reached for the journal. The forest was deathly quiet again, the silence more terrifying than the noise. Slowly, I turned my head. It was there. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, its body impossibly thin, its eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, it tilted its head, its neck cracking with the motion, and took a slow, deliberate step forward. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the journal to my chest, and backed away. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced them to move, retreating step by step. And then it spoke. Its voice was a low, grating whisper, like whine through dead leaves. You can't leave. My blood ran cold. Before I could react, the figure stepped into the light. Its body was wrong, its limbs too long, its joints bending in ways they shouldn't. The skin was stretched thin, pale and translucent, veins pulsing just beneath the surface. I turned and ran, faster than I thought possible, the sound of its pursuit ringing in my ears. The trail opened up suddenly, revealing another clearing. But this one was different. In the center stood a towering stone monument, weathered and ancient, its surface carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The air around it was thick, heavy, almost humming with energy. I didn't stop to question it. I ran to the monument, pressing my back against the cold stone, and turned to face the forest. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing. It didn't cross the invisible boundary, but its glowing eyes never left me. "You can't leave," it repeated, its voice echoing unnaturally. For now, I was safe. But the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The stone monument was my sanctuary. The figure didn't cross into the clearing, but its presence at the edge of the trees loomed like a predator biding its time. I pressed my back harder against the cold, rough surface, clutching the journal like it could protect me. "You can't leave," the figure whispered again, its voice carrying across the clearing like a chill wind. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, its faintly glowing eyes cutting through the shadows. The air around the monument felt different. It wasn't just cold, it was alive, buzzing faintly like static electricity. I risked a glance at the carvings etched into the stone, my fingers brushing over the strange symbols. They felt ancient, their patterns unfamiliar and intricate, like a language forgotten by time. The journal. I fumbled to open it, flipping through the pages in a desperate search for answers. One entry caught my eye. June 16, 1973. I found the altar today. The carvings matched the symbols I've seen in the trees, in the rocks. It's old, older than anything that should be here. I thought it was safe, but now I think it's why I'm trapped. The altar isn't protection. It's a lure. My stomach twisted. A lure? For what? The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, a distant hum, low and rhythmic. It wasn't coming from the figure but from somewhere deeper in the forest. The sound was strange, almost melodic, but it made my skin crawl. The figure tilted its head, listening, and for the first time, it stepped back into the trees. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The humming grew louder, more resonant, as if the forest itself were vibrating. I couldn't pinpoint the source, but it seemed to be all around me. And then I saw them. Shadows. Not like the figure, these were darker, shapeless, flickering like smoke. They drifted between the trees, dozens of them, moving in unison toward the clearing. Toward me. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, the buzzing around the altar intensifying. My breath came in shallow gasps, the pressure in my chest making it hard to think. I turned back to the journal, my hands shaking so badly the pages crinkled. Another entry leapt out. June 18, 1973. The shadows don't speak, but they're worse than the figure. They don't follow the rules. The altar keeps them away, for now, but they're getting bolder. I hear whispers at night. Voices telling me to leave the clearing, to go into the trees. I think the altar is draining me. I'm so tired. I slammed the journal shut, my eyes darting back to the approaching shadows. They stopped just at the edge of the clearing, swirling and twisting like living smoke. The whispers began, a chorus of low, disjointed murmurs that I couldn't make out, yet they pulled at my thoughts, my will. Leave the clearing. Join us. It's safe in the dark. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices were inside my head. A sharp pain shot through my skull, forcing me to my knees. Then I saw something glinting on the ground at the base of the monument. A small, rusted knife, its blade pitted with age but still sharp. Without thinking, I grabbed it, the cold metal biting into my palm. The whispers faltered. The shadows seemed to recoil slightly, their movements growing less fluid, more erratic. You see, the figure's voice rasped from the darkness, though it was nowhere in sight. You understand now. The altar demands sacrifice. I froze, the knife trembling in my hand. The journal's words echoed in my mind, the altar keeps them away, for now. No, I whispered, the word barely audible over the rising hum. I'm not. You already have, the voice interrupted, its tone almost amused. I didn't understand. What was it talking about? The shadows surged forward, stopping just short of the altar's invisible boundary. Their whispering became a deafening cacophony, overlapping voices chanting words I couldn't comprehend. The air grew colder, the buzzing so intense it felt like my skin was vibrating. In a flash of clarity, I realized the altar wasn't just old, it was alive. The symbols pulsed faintly under my fingers, as if feeding on the energy around it. Or on me. The whispers turned to screams, and the shadows threw themselves against the boundary, writhing and clawing at the invisible barrier. Cracks appeared in the air itself, like spiderweb fractures in glass. And then I felt it. A pull. Not from the shadows or the figure, but from the altar. It was like a hand reaching into my chest, gripping my heart and tugging me toward the stone. No! I shouted, staggering back. The knife slipped from my grasp, clattering to the ground. The cracks in the air widened, and for a brief moment, I saw something beyond them, a vast, churning void, blacker than anything I'd ever imagined. Something was in there, shifting in the darkness, watching. The pull grew stronger, dragging me to my knees. My vision blurred, my body felt weightless, and the last thing I heard before everything went black was the figure's voice, cold and certain. The forest doesn't let you leave. It only lets you give in. When I woke up, the forest was gone, or so I thought at first. I was lying on a damp patch of grass, the knife still clutched in my hand. The monument was gone, and the clearing had vanished. Above me, a thin mist clung to the trees, casting everything in a muted gray. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. Then I tried to move. My muscles screamed in protest, heavy and sluggish like I'd been dragged through water. My head pounded, and my chest felt hollow, as if something had been wrenched out of me and replaced with ice. I staggered to my feet, scanning my surroundings. The trail stretched out before me, narrow and faint, but it was there, a direction, a chance to escape. The memory of the figure, the shadows, the altar, all of it hit me like a wave, and panic clawed its way up my throat. But I couldn't stay here. The forest was alive, shifting, trapping me. If I stopped, it would swallow me whole. The trail led uphill, twisting between the trees. I moved as fast as my body would allow, every step weighed down by the invisible force that clung to me. The air felt thicker now, harder to breathe, and the silence was absolute. My thoughts spiraled as I walked. None of this made sense. Was I hallucinating? Maybe I'd hit my head, fallen, and this was some kind of fever dream. The altitude could mess with people, especially if they weren't prepared. But hallucinations didn't leave bruises. I glanced at my arms, at the faint, dark marks blooming on my skin. They looked like fingerprints. Maybe the journal was right, maybe the altar was ancient, a relic of some forgotten time, and I'd stumbled into its trap. Could it have been created by some long-lost civilization? Or was it something older, something beyond human understanding? The thought chilled me, but I forced myself to keep walking. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes, it was impossible to tell. The mist grew thicker, wrapping around the trees like a shroud. The trail blurred at the edges, its lines soft and uncertain. And then I saw it. A cairn. No. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. It was the same stack of stones I'd seen earlier, perfectly balanced in the middle of the trail. I was back where I'd started. No, I whispered, shaking my head. No, no, no. I broke into a run, veering off the trail into the underbrush. Branches tore at my clothes, leaves slapped against my face, but I didn't care. I had to get out, had to find something that made sense. But the forest didn't let me go far. After what felt like miles of running, I burst into another clearing. My heart sank. The altar stood before me, tall and silent. The symbols carved into its surface pulsed faintly, as if mocking me. "No!" I shouted, my voice raw. I hurled the knife at the altar, but it clattered harmlessly to the ground, as if it had hit something unseen. I sank to my knees, the weight of the forest pressing down on me. Tears blurred my vision, frustration and fear choking me. "What do you want from me?" I screamed into the void. The forest answered with silence. Then a new thought crept in, cold and insidious. What if there was no escape? What if I wasn't meant to leave? I tried to push the thought away, but it clung to me, whispering at the edges of my mind. Maybe I'd already crossed some line, taken a step too far. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a predator, and I was its prey. But why me? Why now? I thought of the journal, of the man who had written those frantic entries. Had he escaped? Had he given in? No, I said to myself, shaking my head. I'm not giving up. There has to be a way out. I stood, wiping my face with shaking hands. If the forest wanted me trapped, it had to have rules, rules I could break, patterns I could exploit. My mind raced through possibilities. Could the cairns be markers, showing me the way? Or were they warnings, telling me where not to go? Was the altar protecting me from the shadows, or was it luring me back? The buzzing in the air returned, faint at first but growing stronger. My heart sank as I saw the shadows creeping into the clearing again, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke. The figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. "You can't leave," it rasped, its voice like wind through dead trees. But I noticed something this time, its gaze flickered, just for a moment, to the altar. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. The altar wasn't just a trap. It was a key. Whatever was holding me here, the altar was connected to it. If I could figure out how to use it, or destroy it, I might have a chance. I turned to face the stone, the buzzing growing louder, the shadows pressing closer. "I don't care what you are," I said through clenched teeth. "I'm getting out of here." The shadows surged, the figure stepped closer, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with energy. But I wouldn't stop. Not until I uncovered the truth. The buzzing grew louder, an electric hum that felt like it was vibrating in my bones. The shadows were closing in, their movements frenzied and chaotic. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on me. But my focus was on the altar. Somewhere in its ancient, weathered stone, I knew the answers were buried. I approached cautiously, my hands trembling as I traced the strange carvings with my fingers. The symbols pulsed faintly, glowing like embers in the misty light. They seemed alive, responding to my touch. The journal's words echoed in my mind, "The altar isn't protection. It's a lure." But for what? The buzzing intensified, and suddenly, the symbols began to shift beneath my fingers, rearranging themselves into new patterns. My breath caught as the air around me grew heavier, almost suffocating. And then, the first vision came. The world blurred, the forest fading away. I was no longer standing by the altar, I was somewhere else, somewhere ancient. The trees were younger, the air cleaner. The clearing was bustling with people, their faces obscured but their movements frantic. They were building the altar. I watched as they hauled massive stones, their hands smeared with blood. A figure in dark robes stood at the center of the activity, chanting in a guttural language that made my skin crawl. The crowd seemed afraid, their gazes flickering between the robed figure and the surrounding forest. As the final stone was placed, the robed figure raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent. A deep rumble echoed through the clearing, and the ground beneath me shook. Something ancient and terrible stirred in the earth. The vision shifted. I was now in the same clearing, but it was night. The altar stood completed, its surface glistening with fresh blood. The robed figure was gone, replaced by a group of terrified people. They were tied to the altar, their screams muffled by the chanting of others who surrounded them. The forest seemed alive, its shadows twisting and writhing as if in response to the ceremony. A deep, guttural growl resonated from the darkness, and the crowd fell silent. I didn't want to see what happened next, but I couldn't look away. A massive, shadowy form emerged from the trees, its outline shifting and indistinct. It moved like smoke, its glowing eyes piercing the gloom. The crowd began to chant again, louder this time, as the creature approached the altar. The vision blurred, the scene dissolving into darkness. I stumbled back, gasping for air as the forest snapped back into focus. My legs wobbled, and I gripped the altar for support. The shadows around me were restless now, their whispering louder, more insistent. The figure at the edge of the clearing stepped closer, its glowing eyes narrowing. What did you do?" I whispered, my voice shaking. It didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, a faint smirk curling its lips. Another vision struck me, this one sharper, more vivid. I saw the journal's author, a man with hollow eyes and trembling hands. He was in the clearing, staring at the altar with a mix of fear and desperation. Around him, the forest seemed to close in, the shadows inching closer. He flipped through the journal, muttering to himself. His voice cracked as he shouted at the trees, begging for answers. Then he did something that made my stomach drop. He slashed his palm with a knife, letting the blood drip onto the altar. The shadows recoiled instantly, their forms flickering like dying flames. The buzzing in the air subsided, and for a moment, the man looked relieved. But then the ground beneath him shifted, and the altar glowed brighter, its symbols rearranging themselves once more. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the clearing, and the man's relief turned to terror. The vision ended abruptly, and I was back in the present. The figure was closer now, standing just outside the boundary of the clearing. Its voice rasped, low and menacing. "You see now. The price." "What price?" I shouted, though I already knew the answer. "The altar demands blood. It always has." I shook my head, stepping away from the stone. No. No, this isn't real. This can't be real." The figure tilted its head again, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You don't understand yet. But you will." The buzzing returned, louder than ever, and the shadows surged forward, battering against the invisible boundary around the clearing. Cracks formed in the air, jagged lines that spread like fractures in glass. I backed away, my mind racing. The altar was more than a lure, it was a beacon. A tether between this world and whatever ancient force lived in the forest. And the blood sacrifices hadn't stopped it. They'd fed it. I turned and ran, the journal clutched tightly in my hand. The whispers followed me, the forest shifting and warping around me. I had to find a way out. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hungry. And it wasn't finished with me yet. I stumbled into the clearing, my legs numb, my chest heaving with each desperate breath. The forest had twisted and turned on me so many times that I'd given up trying to make sense of its paths. Each step felt like a cruel loop, leading me further into its grip. The sight ahead stopped me cold. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Dangling from one of those branches was a man. The rope, thick and rotting, creaked faintly as the body swayed. I froze. My legs refused to move, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The man's body hung limp, his arms dangling at awkward angles, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. The pale, bloated skin of his neck bulged grotesquely around the noose. There was something familiar about him. I took a hesitant step forward, my boots sinking into the mossy ground. The buzzing in the air returned, faint but insistent, like a warning I didn't understand. As I drew closer, recognition struck me like a blow to the chest. It was him. The man from the visions. The one who'd built the altar. The one whose panicked scribbles filled the journal clutched in my hands. The rope creaked as his body swayed again, and I felt my stomach churn. I wanted to look away, to turn and run, but I couldn't. Something held me there, rooted to the spot. The air around me thickened, growing colder with each passing second. My breaths came out in shallow puffs of mist, the buzzing intensifying until it felt like it was rattling my skull. The man's head moved. I flinched, my heart hammering against my ribs. His head jerked slightly, his neck twisting further to one side with an audible crack. It wasn't the wind. The movement was deliberate. I took a step back, but my legs were trembling so badly that I nearly stumbled. The journal slipped from my hands, landing with a soft thud on the mossy ground. The man's eyes opened. They weren't empty like I'd expected. They were full of something I couldn't name, anger, fear, maybe even pain. His gaze locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of his stare like a physical force, pressing down on me, pinning me in place. The buzzing reached a fever pitch, drowning out every other sound. My vision blurred, the forest around me spinning wildly. My knees buckled, and I hit the ground hard, my hands clutching at my temples. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. The man's body was still, his eyes closed once more. The rope creaked faintly as he swayed, but the oppressive energy in the air had lifted. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then the shadows came. They appeared at the edges of the clearing, writhing and twisting like living smoke. They moved with purpose, closing in on the tree in slow, deliberate waves. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shadows surged forward, their forms flickering and shifting, and wrapped themselves around the man's legs. His body jerked violently, the noose groaning under the strain. The rope snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and his body was dragged into the blackness. The clearing was silent once more. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the journal with trembling hands. The oak tree stood empty now, its branches bare and lifeless. The shadows had receded, disappearing into the dark corners of the forest. But I knew they hadn't gone far. I turned and ran, my legs barely able to carry me. The forest blurred around me, the paths twisting and looping like a maze. The buzzing in the air returned, faint but ever present. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted. The memory of the hanged man's lifeless eyes burned in my mind, his presence seared into my thoughts. He was a warning, a sign of what this place could do. And deep down, I knew I couldn't outrun it forever. This forest was alive. It had been feeding for centuries, and now, it had chosen me. The forest tightened around me with every step I took, the air growing colder, thicker, as though the trees themselves were pressing in. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I kept running. The journal was tucked under one arm, and the knife I'd found earlier was clenched tightly in my other hand. The knife had been a curiosity when I'd first found it, a weathered, rusted relic at the base of the altar. But now, it felt heavier, its cold metal vibrating faintly in my grip, almost as if it had a pulse of its own. The buzzing in the air intensified, a low hum that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, wrapping around me, invading my thoughts. The shadows had begun to reappear, slithering between the trees, their forms more distinct now. They weren't just smoke. As I stumbled onto another narrow path, the shadows emerged fully into view. They were tall, humanoid in shape, their limbs unnaturally long and thin. Their bodies shimmered, a dark, liquid-like substance dripping from their forms and evaporating into the air. They moved slowly, deliberately, their heads tilting as if studying me. But what struck me most were their eyes, dozens of them. Tiny, glowing orbs embedded in their featureless faces, blinking in erratic patterns. I gripped the knife tighter, the blade vibrating more intensely now, almost as if it were reacting to the creatures. The shadows didn't advance all at once. Instead, they circled me, their movements synchronized, like wolves herding prey. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what I'd seen, what I'd learned. The altar was a tether, a doorway to something ancient and terrible. But the shadows, what were they? Then it hit me. The journal had mentioned sacrifices, blood spilled to keep the shadows at bay. The altar demanded offerings, and the knife was part of that ritual. But the sacrifices hadn't been to appease the shadows. They'd been to contain them. These weren't just random entities, they were bound to this place. The altar was both their prison and their anchor, and the forest had been feeding them for centuries. The buzzing surged, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like icy claws raking through my ribcage. The shadows stopped circling, their forms solidifying as they turned toward me in unison. I didn't have time to think. One of them lunged, its elongated arm reaching out, its fingers stretching into jagged, razor-sharp points. I dodged instinctively, tripping over a root and landing hard on my back. The knife slipped from my grasp, skidding across the ground. Panic shot through me as the shadows closed in, their movements growing more frantic, more erratic. I scrambled toward the knife, my fingers brushing against the cold metal just as one of the creatures lashed out. The blade flared. A burst of light erupted from the knife, blinding and searing. The shadows recoiled instantly, their forms writhing and contorting as they fled back into the trees. The light wasn't warm or comforting, it was harsh, cold, and unnatural, like a surgical beam cutting through the darkness. The buzzing in the air quieted, but the forest didn't feel any less oppressive. I stared at the knife, its blade glowing faintly now, the symbols etched into its surface pulsing in time with the buzzing I had come to dread. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a key. My mind raced as I pieced it together. The altar, the knife, the shadows, they were all connected. The knife's light hadn't just repelled the shadows. It had weakened them, disrupted whatever force bound them to this place. But the altar, it still loomed in the background of my thoughts, an enigma I couldn't unravel. If the knife was a key, then what did the altar lock away? Or worse, what did it unlock? I got to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. The shadows hadn't gone far, I could feel them watching from the trees, waiting for their chance to strike again. I couldn't stop now. The answers I needed were tied to the altar, and I had to return to it. Clutching the knife tightly, I pressed forward, retracing my steps through the twisting paths of the forest. The buzzing grew louder with each step, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, as if the trees themselves were trying to stop me. When I finally reached the clearing, the altar stood silent and unyielding, its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. The symbols etched into its stone pulsed in time with the vibrations of the knife, as if the two were resonating with one another. The air around the altar was different now, heavier, charged with an almost electrical energy. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the shadows lingering just beyond the clearing's edge. I approached the altar cautiously, the knife's glow intensifying as I drew closer. The symbols on the stone shifted, rearranging themselves in patterns that seemed almost alive. I placed the knife on the altar's surface. The reaction was immediate. The symbols flared brightly, their light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The buzzing reached a deafening crescendo, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. The shadows surged forward, their forms writhing and clawing at the invisible barrier that surrounded the clearing. They weren't attacking me, they were attacking the altar. And then, the altar spoke. Not in words, but in feelings, a deep, primal fear that clawed at the edges of my mind. It wasn't just a tether. It wasn't just a prison. It was a doorway. The truth hit me like a blow. The sacrifices hadn't been to feed the shadows, they'd been to keep whatever lay beyond the altar from coming through. The shadows weren't my enemy. They were the guardians. I don't know how long I stood in the clearing, staring at the altar. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of what I'd seen and felt in this cursed place. The buzzing in the air had quieted, replaced by an eerie stillness. The knife in my hand pulsed faintly, its symbols glowing in sync with the ones etched into the altar. I had to make sense of it all, the shadows, the hanged man, the cairns. The pieces were there, scattered across this nightmare, and I was the only one left to put them together. I knelt beside the altar, placing the journal on its surface. The stone was warm to the touch, as if alive. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages again, hunting for something I'd missed. The hanged man's entries were disjointed, frantic, but the patterns were becoming clearer. The cairns, the altar, the sacrifices, they weren't random. They were a system. The cairns marked paths through the forest, trails carved by those who came before me. Each stack of stones was a waypoint, a desperate attempt to leave breadcrumbs in a place designed to confuse and trap. But none of them had made it out. The altar, I realized, was the center of it all. It wasn't just a structure, it was a mechanism, a lock keeping something sealed. And the knife was the key. I thought back to the visions. The people who built the altar weren't worshippers, they were terrified. The symbols weren't for praise, they were wards, meant to contain whatever they'd awakened. But something had gone wrong. The buzzing returned, faint and insistent, tugging at the edges of my mind. I could feel the shadows watching me from the tree line, waiting for me to make a move. They weren't attacking now. They seemed hesitant. The hanged man. He hadn't been a victim. He'd been a guardian, his spirit bound to the altar to keep the seal intact. His death hadn't been an accident, it had been a choice. He'd sacrificed himself to stop whatever lay beneath the altar from escaping. I ran my fingers over the symbols etched into the knife, their sharp edges biting into my skin. They matched the ones on the altar, their patterns intricate and deliberate. The knife wasn't a weapon. It was a tool, forged for a single purpose. A deep hum reverberated through the ground, and the altar's symbols began to glow more brightly. The air grew colder, the forest tightening its grip around me. The shadows shifted, their forms flickering in and out of focus. They weren't just mindless creatures, they were guardians too, tethered to this place, just like the hanged man. They were trying to stop the altar from being used again, to keep it from opening. The journal had described blood sacrifices, but I knew now they weren't to appease the shadows. They were to keep the altar's lock engaged. Every drop of blood spilled here had reinforced the seal, binding the void beneath the earth. But the sacrifices had been corrupted. Over time, people who came here were lured by the forest's power, their deaths feeding the wrong side of the equation. The altar was a balance, and I had tipped it. The buzzing reached a deafening crescendo, and the ground beneath me shook violently. Cracks formed in the earth around the altar, jagged lines glowing with an unnatural light. The void was awakening. I gripped the knife tightly, my mind racing. The journal said nothing about undoing the seal, only maintaining it. But the hanged man's actions had told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't sealed the altar with blood. He'd done it with his life. I understood now. The forest needed a guardian, a soul to bind the seal and keep the void contained. The hanged man's time had ended, and his death had weakened the altar's power. That's why the forest had brought me here. I looked down at the knife, its glow pulsating in my hand. It wasn't just a key. It was a conduit. The altar flared with light, and the shadows surged forward, their forms breaking apart as they threw themselves against the glowing symbols. They weren't trying to harm me, they were trying to stop me. I stepped forward, raising the knife. The altar seemed to respond, its glow intensifying, the symbols shifting into new patterns. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I placed the blade against my palm and pressed down. Pain shot through me as the blade cut deep, my blood spilling onto the altar. The symbols flared brighter, the buzzing reaching an unbearable pitch. The ground beneath me split open, revealing a swirling void of blackness, its edges seething with raw, incomprehensible energy. The void's presence was overwhelming, its hunger palpable. But the altar held it back, its light pushing against the darkness. I placed my hand on the altar, feeling the warmth of the stone spread through me. The knife burned in my grip, its light merging with the altar's. I felt a pull, deep and primal, as the forest reached for me. This was the price. The hanged man's face flashed in my mind, his hollow eyes filled with the same fear that now gripped me. He'd stood here before me, made this same choice. The altar wasn't a prison. It was a balance, and I was its new anchor. I closed my eyes, letting the pull take hold. My body grew heavy, the sounds of the forest fading into nothingness. The shadows retreated, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The buzzing quieted, replaced by a deep, resonant hum. When I opened my eyes, the void was gone. The forest was silent. I was still standing by the altar, but I couldn't move. My hands were fused to the stone, the knife gone, its purpose fulfilled. The altar pulsed faintly beneath my palms, its warmth a constant reminder of the price I'd paid. I was the new guardian now, bound to the forest, my soul tethered to the altar. And one day, when my strength failed, the forest would call for another.